leaves of the deciduous. This is an image that is captured when the leaves of deciduous trees are off, and it reveals more detail about the structures that might be obscured by the trees' leaves whenever the leaves are on in the summertime in full bloom. And so I just wanted to check in with the moderator, make sure everything were okay in Zoom first. And this is going to be recorded, so you can go back and look at the presentation. And I've also provided a PDF of the slides without the animations, obviously, because it's a printable PDF, but it has the resources and links in there. Also, it has the narrative, my notes. So if you have trouble hearing me or understanding, the narrative is in the PDF as well. Okay, just try to get my. So the topic agendas, the topic is obviously remote sensing for mining and reclamation. But I just kind of wanted to outline some of the high points I'm going to talk about. And that is what the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement is and what we do. I'm going to go into what remote sensing is, and then talk specifically about the platforms, sensors, access, and the analytics that apply to remote sensing. And then I'm going to talk specifically about an application for monitoring reclamation that I've done in the time I've been with OSM. And then we'll have a summary for Q&A, and we can do the hands-on. And I've left enough information to do the hands-on if we run out of time, but I think we'll be in good shape because we're only a little bit about 8 after. So the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement was established on August 3rd, 1977, when President Carter signed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977 into law. And the mission of the OSMRE is to carry out the requirements of that act in cooperation with the states and tribes. And the primary objectives are to ensure that coal mines are operated in a manner that protects citizens and the environment during mining and assures that the land is restored to beneficial use following mining, and to also mitigate the effects of past mining by aggressively pursuing reclamation of abandoned coal mines. And that's kind of our mission statement in a nutshell. But going a little bit into further detail, there's 3 main functions that are defined in the United States Code and in the codes of federal regulations. First, the OSMRE regulates active mines, and in doing this function, remote sensing systems are used to monitor the land change and production information. And second, OSMRE reclaims lands damaged by surface mining and abandoned mines. Remote sensing systems are used along with historical information such as maps from the Mine Map Repository to assist in reclamation decision making. And lastly, OSMRE also provides the resources, the technical assistance and training, technology development to our state and tribal partners. The branch I work with is with the Technology Management Division within the Western Region of OSMRE. Specifically, I work for the Geospatial Information Services branch, which is located at the Denver Federal Center in Building 41. Unfortunately, we were in the downtown Denver area, but we were moving right when the pandemic hit and closed everything down in March. It's been sort of an interesting move because there's not a lot of people here. But this pictometry image on the bottom shows the patio space and the of the Building 41 where we work. And the top one shows, it's just a ground-based photo from my mobile phone. It's showing the space with some of the propeller arrow points that we have to keep maintained. And we have them laid out on our patio space there. Due to the pandemic, we don't go to the office very much except to maintain equipment. And being able to adapt to the telework has presented some new challenges in adopting to home offices. And also it has resulted in a greater demand for remote sensing. Coincidentally, I live near an area with lots of abandoned mines and new road building. Doing remote sensing work isn't so bad from home. So this, fortunately for me, it provides a good real-world site to study reclamation and recovery right at home. In this slide, there's 2 images that are taken with the Eagle View pictometry sensor on different dates shown side by side. The image on the left was taken on May 25th in 2010, when quite a bit of digging and hauling groundwork was going on. And the image on your right was taken in June 1st, 2019. And my house is the house that's circled in yellow. Since my colleagues and I were keenly interested in reclamation and ecological restoration, my home also serves as a good place to look at remote sensing imagery, as well as maintain some field proficiency for things like doing ground control and surveying, spectral measurements, XRF measurements, and things like that. We're able to do that in small groups in a pretty realistic setting. So it's clear in these two images, though, that reclamation processes and restoration processes can take a long time. These images are 9 years apart, and there's still a bare surface where the trees were removed during the road building. Now, going into that in the context of reclamation and restoration obligations, for surface coal mining, there are several inspection priorities that OSMRE inspectors have to address. And those are like hydrological features such as drainages and diversions and impoundments, acid mine expressions, understanding treated areas and how well the treatment processes are working, as well as other features. And the topography and terrain features such as the elevation model, the slope angle, the shape, curvature, and lengths, as well as the slope aspect and direction are really important from a geotechnical and geoengineering perspective to make sure that the land meets the post-mining land use requirements. The viewshed properties are easily modeled to improve the aesthetics of the mining operations. Blasting and concentric impact zones are also inspection priorities, and sometimes citizens encounter impacts from those activities. Material volumetrics and production patterns are readily observed with earth observations too, and contemporaneous reclamation activity demonstrates the commitment of the mining operation to reclaiming the landscape. And that goes hand in hand with observing the changes in the superficial geological changes in the vegetation cover. Lastly, the vegetation and land use classification priorities are of interest in reclamation, so we can see how well that those reclamation processes that are used are performing and understanding better the climate impacts on those processes. So it's really important to be able to measure that, and from a performance perspective and engineering perspective. And having these shared goals for environmental monitoring met with timely observations that are adequate resolution. We also have to consider the privacy concerns. So a lot of the space policies address that, and that's why we have to be sensitive to some of the systems that are extremely high resolution. We also have to consider the privacy as well as the accessibility of the information. These two images are satellite images that were collected by the European Space Agency's Copernicus Sentinel 2 multispectral satellite on June 21st of 2018. And this is near the Antelope New Rochelle mine, which is near Wright, Wyoming, in the Powder River Basin. And the image on the left is a rendering of the normalized different vegetation index, which is a measure of greenness figure of the surface vegetation. And since this area is rather arid, the active mining areas are shown in red, and the sparse vegetation is shown in yellow, and the various vegetation class shown in green. The blue shows vegetation growing along provincial creeks and drainages. On the right, that same multispectral image is rendered in a different way using the shortwave infrared region of the spectrum. And this kind of rendering can help make the map show, the renderings will show the newly retopsoiled and reseeded areas of the mine site. But how do we do all this? I mean, it just, this is through a web browser, but how does it happen? What's all the magic happening behind the scenes? And that's where we get into what remote sensing is. We have to explain that so that we can make users understand the data that they're looking at when they're looking at these really cool and very easily accessible web browser interfaces for remote sensing data. So according to the American Society of Photogrammetrics and Remote Sensing, and the American Geosciences Institute. Remote sensing is the science of collecting, processing, and interpreting images that record the interaction between electromagnetic energy and matter. In historical terms, this usually refers to overhead imagery. With the proliferation of sensors of many types and data analytics capabilities, Internet of Things, even things that we wouldn't think of as typical overhead sensors can be used and fused with them. For example, something that's measuring displacement or a geophone, for example, can be used in this way and represented. But with the branding, we're enticed with the newer branding of the Imaging and Geospatial Information Society. And we're becoming a lot more aware of the capabilities, big data operas that is not imaging in the typical historical sense. I get asked a lot if remote sensing is a GIS. And no, it's not. A geographic information system is a GIS and is comprised of 5 parts, excuse me. The hardware part is the computers, the mobile devices, cloud resources, and other IT equipment. And the software and the applications part are the applications used for the various functions. For example, OSMRE ArcGIS or the open source QGIS. The data part of a GIS is another critical component of the GIS data. In fact, it's huge. We have to worry about things like the big V's of big data, the volume, the velocity, the variety, and the veracity of all those data sources coming into a GIS. So the methods and procedures are documented processes for the system. And of course, people are the fifth and most important part. That includes the creators and the managers of the geospatial data to the IT specialists that are running the cloud to the users of the system. And it's just a really important thing to make a distinction that GIS is not remote sensing. I mean, they are different. Remote sensing similarly needs the hardware, software, and people methods to be good, but it's distinct that it's not a GIS, it's a data set that's imported and used in a GIS. And more we see that it is a data set in machine learning and deep learning systems as well. In a nutshell, when it comes down to it, remote sensing imaging components are best described as being comprised of 3 parts. The first is the platform. This is what the sensor is mounted on in order to provide the observation perspective necessary to see the specific phenomenon of interest. The platforms are manned and unmanned, with autonomous control platforms becoming the norm rather than the exception. The platforms can be deployed immediately, or they can be stationary, collecting measurements for a very long period of time. The sensors are what measures and record the electromagnetic energy and other phenomena for processing and analysis. And most people are familiar with the visible sensors, especially the ones in our mobile devices. These sensors operate using the red, green, and blue spectrum, which is rendered to approximate human vision. The other sensors use the other regions of the electromagnetic spectrum, which I'll get to in a minute. So the measurements that are recorded by the sensors, as well as the measurements relevant to the platform, such as orientation and speed, are processed, analyzed, stored, and disseminated for their specific use and capabilities. And high-performance computing, as well as dedicated workstations, are used for the processing and management of remote sensing data. This is kind of moving to the platform part of it. This is just some examples, knowing that we have those 3 main components of remote sensing: the platform, the sensor, and the processing system. We can take a look at them in different details. This image is an example of platforms used in remote sensing. The sensors are mounted on them to collect data in form of imagery and other formats. The workhorses in terms of coverage and accessibility are the spaceborne platforms, such as the airplanes, unmanned aircraft, balloons, kites, airships, amphibious, and submersible units. And they offer versatile ways to mount a sensor to suit a specific application. For mining and reclamation, being able to map the surface characteristics on a regular basis to compare the changes in the landscape is important. making sure that your platform can adequately and safely support your sensor, especially if your sensor is an expensive one, is a critical engineering consideration. So some of these I could just, kind of go over and point out. I mean, we have a spaceborne sensor like the one that's shown of the Sentinel-2 satellite. The aircraft, that's a little part of it, that's actually a NEON aircraft from the National Ecological Observing Network up in Boulder, Colorado. And it's running the AVRIS hyperspectral sensor. The yellow tripod has a Regal full waveform LiDAR sensor mounted on it, and we have used that on a test site here locally at the Mount Falcon Park. And then, of course, you see the M600 DJI hexacopter, quadricopter, and hexacopter drones that have a very expensive head wall hyperspective sensor with the Velodyne LiDAR puck to register the hyperspectral content. So the sensor is obviously much more expensive than the M600, which is a really good thing to talk about the platforms too. The skill of the person operating the platform is critical. So obviously the drones and the ships and the submersibles have some element of control, but takes some skill. Some of the handheld things, like my boss is shown in that photo holding a handheld GeoSlam, which is a LiDAR mapping unit. So there really isn't any limit to the type of platform. It's basically your imagination. And so it's kind of really critical to think about this from an engineering perspective, especially if you get into designing platforms for remote sensing. So onto the sensors. It's important to understand that most remote sensing sensors are measuring and recording electromagnetic energy. And so this graphic here describes the electromagnetic energy spectrum from radio waves, microwaves, infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays. For the space-based observations we're going to dive in today, we have to consider the effect of the atmosphere on our measurements. When you wake up this morning and you saw the smoky skies outside, you might imagine it can be pretty difficult to correct for that smoke using a standard imaging satellite. And so that's why we have the depiction here of the optical window for infrared and visible regions. Not only do we have the smoke, but we also have other molecules like oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur dioxides and oxides of nitrogen and all kinds of different things that interfere with the sensors in space. So we have a pretty good knowledge of the electromagnetic spectrum in terms of being able to apply it in remote sensing. So this optical window shows where the atmospheric absorptions occur. We can't really use those wavelengths as much. But when we want to be able to image things through clouds like hot fires or flooding, things that like that nature, we can use other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, such as in synthetic aperture radar, which uses the area in the radio window, which you can see is clear from being obscured by the atmosphere. And so that way, matter and energy interact are really important considerations for remote sensing. And I just wanted to bring up the scientific basis, the predication of how sensors are designed. The way that matter and energy interact are considered for the sensor design. So a good portion of the data exploits the properties of reflectance in the different regions of the visible and infrared spectrum, and other interactions are exploited as well. For example, in gas imaging, the concepts of emission and absorption are exploited. So there really is a physical, chemical, and material science basis for how all of this magic works. So how can one tell which platform and sensor to use, especially in the context of mining applications? Well, first you have to consider the resolution of the system. It's important to consider resolution in all areas in science and engineering. And resolution is a whole lot more, much more than scale. Just ask any astrophotographer or microbiologist. In remote sensing, resolution is considered in four different broader terms: the spatial, spectral, radiometric, and temporal resolutions. So the spatial resolution refers to the smallest possible feature that can be detected. And for the Earth observations and landscape characterization community, this is often expressed in ground sample distance in meters. Spectral resolution refers to the ability of a sensor to define specific wavelength intervals known as spectral bands. And the radiometric resolution is the sensitivity to the magnitude of the electromagnetic energy of the specific wavelengths. And finally, the temporal resolution describes how often the sensor images the area of interest, known as the revisit time. And I just wanted to point out, because we probably have a whole diverse group of people on the call that may have never used remote sensing or GIS, or they're very, they're on their way to being a seasoned expert. And I just wanted to point out some resources that I use quite a bit for looking up specific systems. EO Portal has a really nice catalog of just about every spaceborne asset there is, so you can get the nitty-gritty details about that specific asset. Also, looking up spectral bands and indices for specific systems, I use the index database that's hosted out of Germany that has the specific band characteristics of the sensor, as well as some of the commonly used index for the sensor. So it's a really nice, helpful lookup tool with some references as well. And then the other question I get a lot is, a newbie, I want the LiDAR, I want the topos, I want it all. If you're in the United States, I highly recommend using the national map. For hydrologists, the hydrology layers at the local level of resolution are in there, and that's very, very commonly requested, and it's all available to anyone publicly in the national map. And so I just wanted to point out those resources that are available to you to use as a public, as part of the public. So some of the remote sensing systems that we use at the Office of Surface Mining, some of them are paid. I mean, that means that we have to pay for the service, and some of them are open to the public, and we can, anyone can use them. So some of the ones that I have examples here for the spaceborne systems are the Landsat, the Copernicus Sentinels, both which are free and available to the public, and Digital Globe and Planet Labs, which are not free and available to the public, but those are our 4 workhorse spaceborne sensor complements. For the airborne systems, which include historical photo archives from as far back as the 1930s to quickly deployable unmanned aerial systems, they provide the necessary decision-making information required by reclamation specialists. And some of those are like the Eagle View Pictometry and LiDAR Consortium 3DEP, and USGS and USDA assets such as NHAP, the National High Altitude Aerial Photography Program, as well as the DOI, UAS. We have been grounded, of course, so I have to give you an update of as soon as we are ungrounded and be able to fly again. So the other things I wanted to point out, the terrestrial systems are really important because they provide the ability for us to ground truth spaceborne and airborne observations. So that consists of our human inspectors, the GNSS and GPS mapping, the LiDAR that's done on the ground, as well as the ground-based networks like Neon, SpeedoCam, which are cameras that take pictures every 20 minutes of different sites. And so those are other ways that we can kind of validate some of the observations we make using the spaceborne and airborne systems. So OSMRE has an established history in using remote sensing for mining and reclamation applications. So these are some of the reports that OSMRE has on the Department of the Interior Remote Sensing annual reports website that is publicly accessible. In particular, these reports describe how remote sensing is used and evaluated to meet specific mining problems. We also have an older report in there that talked about using remote sensing to do virtual inspections. And that was long before the pandemic impacted the way we work. With all that, I wanted to kind of just pivot to talk specifically about how we use remote sensing to monitor one of the reclamation sites in Utah, the Cottonwood site. And this was mine was a site of a mine fire that killed 27 people on December the 19th of 1984. Because of the number of lives lost, it greatly impacted the small communities of Orangeville, Castledale, and Price, and it really impacted the mining industry and community as a whole, just the sheer magnitude of the loss of life and right before Christmas. And it was really important to consider the historical community significance of this area during the reclamation planning phases. So these are just a couple of photos that show the site from the Salt Lake City Tribune when it was burning in December of 1984. So the reclamation specialists and the mine operators used historical imagery for planning the reclamation work. And this image is the oldest one that I found in the Utah State Geology Archive. The image is a digital scan of an aerial photograph taken of the Cottonwood Mine site in 1938. And some of the things that the remote sensing specialists pick up on are the shadows, depending on what time of the year and the time of the day the photographs were taken, to reveal a great deal about the landscape characteristics. And this is how the Cottonwood Mine looks before the reclamation. This is the site in June of 2010. No steep terrain, and how the shadows reveal the sheer geological formation. And the trees that we observed in 1938 image resemble the trees that we see in this high resolution modern image too. They are evergreen variety trees with a few deciduous in there. Some of the older ones have stuck around though. So what are some of the other features that you notice in this image, such as the loadout, the processing infrastructure, ponds? There's 2 ponds here, and this yellow line is describing how far, how wide it is at that point, and it's 37 meters right here. So the other thing is that you can see is the coloration of the soil. You can obviously see where there was coal, and then some of the other geological characteristics in this imagery. Sorry, my audio cut out there for a second. Can you still hear me, Muto?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. In October of 2017, the mine operator began really significant earthwork on the Cottonwood site. And you notice the shadows again in the ground-based images. They could tell you a lot about the terrain. There's a lot of variability and slope and aspect going on. It's a site that's remote, it's variable, and the drainage patterns are readily observed. So the white rock is serving as a new channel, which restores the historical Grimes wash. The 2 ponds were removed and reformed the structure in the channel. The topsoil was used to cover areas adjacent to the channels, and a method called pocking, and you can see that in the image on the right. It was used to create indentations in the topsoil. And the reason for this was to provide the best chance for new vegetation to reestablish itself. The pocking, it's in an arid area and they get a lot of monsoon rains and things like that. So this was one way to try to emulate the way nature would be able to allow the sticker, which that's the green material in there that has the seeds, the mulch, and the fertilizer, to have a better chance during those monsoon rain events. And so all of these things were chosen by the mine operator working with ecologists and reclamation specialists to restore the area to its pre-mining condition or better. So even though the June 2018 fire that happened nearby didn't destroy this area, the impacts of the burn area are concerned to the ecologists and reclamation specialists, since it will have some impact on the local hydrology and habitat. And so with that, we wanted to monitor the reclamation work. And so this animation, which I'm going to go ahead and start, and I hope that it will come through okay on Zoom, because I've never done this before on Zoom. So we use satellite imagery from the Digital Globe constellation, which is a high resolution task constellation, to show the changes that occurred from November 16th to the present. Notice how much the area has changed This is a commercially available constellation that offers 1 meter ground sample distance or less. I mean, most of the time is much less than 1 meter, so it's very high resolution. It is expensive if you buy it commercially. Government users, can typically access through a federal civilian process through NGA and USGS. But we still continue to use spaceborne observations of different satellite systems because this one is tasked. Sometimes we have clouds in the images and we can't always use them. And so we have to pick and choose the images to use to animate the series, showing the ponds being removed and all of that reclamation activity I just showed you with the ground-based photos. So I hope that everyone can see the animation okay, because I know that sometimes it could show up as a gray box or a black box or something, and just want to check in and make sure everyone's able to see that. And then Planet Labs is another constellation that we use to monitor the same area. These are using PlanetScope dubs, and they offer daily imagery of the whole Earth using a bunch of different CubeSat-sized satellites. They each have their own calibration and validation characteristics and personalities, I guess you could say. And so they're a little bit harder, in terms of using so many of those. But you can still see the change. And so I wanted to go ahead and show that. Hopefully I will be able to. I will have to go to the website for that. I apologize. And so this is animation of the PlanetScope. It's not as high resolution, but because it is more frequently when we talk about those types of resolutions that we have to consider, the temporal resolution of Planet Labs is unsurpassed by any other constellation on the civil market right now. And so here you can see clearly those two ponds, but because the revisit time and the access is a lot more frequent, we can see changes on a more frequent basis. Sometimes the spaceborne imaging can't provide the resolution that we necessarily need to see the smaller features of interest, especially those little individual pockets on the surface. So these sensors, that are located way out in space, and so even the best spaceborne remote sensing information has some limitations. And so in this case, we use highly specialized terrestrial systems like the Regal full waveform LiDAR system and unmanned aerial systems such as the Bird's Eye Firefly Pro with multispectral sensors mounted on them. And they're used to provide higher resolution information for more accurate and precise measurements. The cool thing about having the flexibility to take these things into the field, if you have a cloudy day or it's just persistently smoky, this is another option to be able to map and image some of those features as well. The reason for using unmanned systems are pretty numerous. The sites like this can be dangerous and risky due to the terrain. And also the less human activity in the reclamation areas, the better chance for success they have for recovery and weed management. So our branch is continuing to monitor the site for revegetation and wildlife. So we hope that in the years to come, the burn areas don't impact it too much. But I just wanted to point out that, yes, the space imaging systems, the airborne imaging systems aren't really always the end all be all. Sometimes you have to go in the field and walk it or take some photos or do some higher resolution collections. So this is an example of monitoring the area that burned in the summer of 2018 near the site. So the site that we just went over is in yellow, in the yellow circle. And there was a massive wildfire there. It was called the Trail Mountain Fire. And this photograph was posted to NC Web just to kind of show you the extent of the fire and the photos that the firefighters took. And the animated images are a series of images from the Sentinel-2 that are rendered with the shortwave infrared to show the fire that burned. And we're going to do an animation just like this one together using an EOBrowser for an area in Montana that recently experienced a fire. I kind of wanted to show how easy it is even for a novice user to generate an animated image like this one. Before I get into that too much, I have to explain the type of sensor that we're using for that animation. So the Sentinel-2 system is made up of 2 satellites, Sentinel-2A and Sentinel-2B. The sensors are multispectral sensors that are capable of collecting 13 different wavelengths, which include the red, green, and blue. So we can still see imagery to look like true or natural color. And the easiest way to use the images within the web browser interface, then you're going to be looking at the same source images that remote sensing experts throughout the world use, without all the hassle of trying to find the right computer and the right software and all of that stuff to try to figure it out. So with that, I'm just going to copy this link.
I have the link posted in the chat box. So if participants want to, you can look open by yourself as well.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was like trying to figure out where the chat was. Oh, great. Okay, so you got the link in the chat. Perfect. So first of all, when you first go to the site and log in, there is an eye up here and show info. And this is a really nice tutorial. If you have the time to go through it, it's not very fast. I mean, it's not very long. It's very fast. But I just wanted to point out, we're only looking at Sentinel-2. So if you're interested in looking at a mine site or a reclamation area, there's a whole bunch of other archives that are included in this browser interface. So after what I show you today, hopefully you're inspired and you want to take it to the next step. But that's the easiest way to go ahead and get to the tutorial. And it's extremely easy. I use this to teach middle school kids and they love it. And I've gotten a lot of great feedback on it. And the tutorial is just very intuitive. And so I just wanted to bring that up. One of the things that you'll want to do, you can use the EOBrowser without having a login account. So I can go to that mine site in Wyoming that I showed you earlier, just by typing it in the search box and making sure the Sentinel-2 is highlighted and choosing some dates that I want to look at it. I'm just going to choose the ones from the past month. And of course, you get thumbnails that pop up with all these images. You can click visualize one. And the reason I'm going through this part really quickly is because this is something that you can just jump right in and do without having any kind of account. If you sign up for the free account, you'll be able to do things like animate scenes over time. But I just wanted to point that out. I mean, if you wanted to just go and look at a satellite image, there's actually many, many different archives that you can query through this interface without needing the user account. I have signed up for a user account though, because I wanted to be able to use the animation function and some other things. So I'm just going to go ahead and log into my normal regular user account. So I'm signed in, and I said in the exercise I wanted to use I wanted to go to check out this mine site. It's called the Absaloka site in Montana. And they recently had a fire at the Signal Peak. They call it the Signal Peak or the Sarpy fire. And I wanted to go ahead and see if I could take a look at some imagery at that mine site. And so I know where the Sarpy fire is, and I have the coordinates on the slide here. So if you want to, you can use these same coordinates, or you can use your own site that you want to look at. It's up to you. You can put the coordinates or the place name in several ways when you're searching for satellite imagery. So in the place, you can put the coordinates 45, 754, and then longitude 5. You can put it in that way. There are some other ways you can do it too. If you go over here to this little pentagon looking shape, you can draw an area of interest for your image downloads, or you can upload data. So if you have a Google file from Google, that's a KML or KMZ, a GPX or GeoJSON file, you can search on that. And since I already have kind of an outline for I already have an outline of Absaloka. I'm just going to go ahead and import that in, and you see that there's a blue box of that area, and it tells me that it's about 75 square kilometers. So now that I have my area of interest in there, I can go into search on Sentinel-2. If you use the advanced search slider, remember I talked about earlier in my talk how atmospherically correcting your imagery is really important, especially if you're using it for analysis. So here you can choose the L2A atmospherically corrected image. If you want to do your own atmospheric correction, you can choose the L1C product instead and then use it in your own system for atmospheric correction. But I'm going to go ahead and choose atmospherically corrected, so I want to be able to do analysis right now here in my browser. This is a cloud mask, so you can actually set how many images you're willing to put up with to have clouds in it. And I say that, because I know that there are scientists who study clouds. So we don't want to get rid of all the cloudy images because they're important too. But if you want to be able to mask out some of the images that have too much cloud cover, this is where you do that. I want to look at this area over the past month because I know that they had a recent fire. But in the time range, you can go back quite a ways. And so this is where you would set the time range for the imagery that you're interested in. And bear in mind that Sentinel-2 wasn't launched entirely that long ago, so you're not going to have the same data sets as the Landsat that has all the stuff from the 80s and 90s and everything else. So that's just one caveat to be aware of whenever you are searching for imagery from your specific remote sensing sensor. So I'm going to go ahead and search. I'll back out a little bit here so I can see. And all these blue tiles, you can hover over them, and it will show which ones cover your area to the extent that you need it to be covered. And you can just directly click on it, will bring up another thumbnail window, so you can choose one and go ahead and immediately visualize it. So this image was taken on September 11th, and looking at it, we can clearly see that there's a mine site. This is an arid region, so it might not be apparently obvious that this fire is, this is actually the burn scar of the fire to the south of the site. If you scroll down and choose the shortwave infrared rendering view, do you see how that burn scar that happened a couple weeks ago really pops out? And it did get pretty close to where the active mining areas are. So I just wanted to reach out to those of you guys on the phone. I mean, do you see the utility of using remote sensing in this fashion and being able to immediately access those images on the public domain is important. It's important for industry, the operators, to be able to access this. It's important for academia to access it. It's important for the government, and not just the federal, you know, with the state and tribal and local authorities to access this. And even though it's not super high resolution, you're not reading serial numbers on box trucks or anything like that, you're still able to see some clear landscape changes that have happened recently. Going back up to the indices again, you know, the true color is based on the RGB bands. And if you click that arrow, it actually will tell you what that composite is. And if you're really into the details, you can certainly go in and it will talk about the scripts that are used to do this. And so the reason that I like this platform is because it benefits the expert remote sensing community as well as someone who's brand new at it that just wants to look at a recent picture and they want to render an index and they don't want to have to buy a lot of expensive computer software and hardware because the cloud is doing the heavy lifting on the synergized side of this platform. The same thing is going and looking at the different indices like false color. That's based on the infrared. You can clearly see that burn scar there. But what if I wanted to look at this over time? You know, the important thing is to, if you want to animate your images over time for this area, you want to select the index that you want to render it in the animation. So for example, in here in this instance, if I just stay on true color and I go and I animate some time lapse, it's gonna choose the animation and render it in true color. I kind of want to see where that burn scar, you know, where it is and when did it happen. So say I was doing, you know, something where I needed to know the timing of when the burn happened. I can use the shortwave infrared in this case, or I can use the false color. It doesn't really matter which one. And then I just go to animate. And then the time-lapse animation, you have the calendar come back up again so that you can actually go back and say, I want to look at it, how this mine site looked from June until now. And then I also want to make sure that you know, I don't have a whole lot of clouds in there. And you search right in your animation, time-lapse generation pane. Now, some of these images are going to be cut off, and some of them are going to be cloudy. Clouds are hard to mask. Any remote sensing specialist will tell you that it's been a challenge for quite a while, but machine learning is definitely making it a lot easier for us to mask those cloudy images out.
Hey, Carrie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Judy, can you?
Your mic is cutting in and out.
Oh, it is? Okay. Did I?
And it, yeah,
Did you guys
it just
miss
gets
a
a little
lot?
hard to hear you. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Right now I can, yes.
Okay, good. So basically all I'm doing is I am going in and I'm deselecting the images that I don't want in my animation because they don't include the whole area. And so, so there's a little bit of user interaction to this, but I will show you how quickly we get this animation done. And we see the burn scar appear there, so we know that it had to be in that date and time. So now all I do is push the play button for the images that I've selected, and you can see it animating. And you can see some landscape characteristics, vegetation, phenology, a little bit of you know, hauling and things like that going on. And so then you can see the burn scar when it happened and how close it got to Absaloka. The cool thing is you could download this right now and you have created yourself a time-lapse GIF animation complete with the scale bar and the dates and the branding to put in your PowerPoint to talk to your manager or you know, your landscape or reclamation specialist, and they have something to work with. And it didn't take very long. Just I think it was about 2 minutes and 45 seconds that it took me to do that. So so with that, you know, I just kind of wanted to explain that it's not hard to do, and the more the better. You know, the more people that provide impactful feedback on how to improve these kinds of systems. It's really good. So I know we're coming to the top of the hour, so I just wanted to go in summary of what we did. We talked about who OSMRE is and what we do, and remote sensing is, and some of the resources for learning more about it. And we also learned about how remote sensing is applied in mining and reclamation. And then we also just did a hands-on on using EOBrowser to find and render Sentinel-2A scenes, as well as how to compare them and create the time-lapse animations. So with that, I guess I'll hand it back over to Muthu so he can continue on with his seminar hosting.
Thanks, Carrie. This was really great. Learned a lot of things, and I'm excited to go and look at the site and see some other places, maybe somewhere where what they're doing in India too. I'd like to know. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand or you can unmute and ask a question. I have one from Joe. He's asking, what is the resolution of Sentinel-2?
Resolution of Sentinel-2?
Yeah.
So yes, that is something you can actually see too. The resolution for the different bands is different. So if you go to the lottery ball, and how I just picked an image and I went to visualize and see how you can see the bands here. Some of them are 20 meters and some of them are 10. And so that's why I brought up the EO portal website. And when you want to know specific information about the sensor, this is the best place to go. It's the most authoritative and complete, in my opinion. And so if you go to the missions database, you can see literally there are hundreds and hundreds of them, okay? And so there's no shortage of satellite sensor systems out there that are being used for all kinds of different things. But if we go to the Sentinel-2, it has all of that information in there. I'm just gonna scroll down to the special information because I'm guessing that that is what you're asking. There used to be a table too, so it's just kind of complement. So here you could see that the 10-meter bands are the veneer, and then the red edge, you know, there are several red edge and bands that are in the 20-meter range, and then the thermal for, or sphere for 60-meter, the 3 bands. And going back to EOBrowser, I mean, it's just really easy because you can hover over the bands that, you know, are represented here, and like I call it the lottery balls, you know, and then you can actually look and see band 6 is a vegetation red edge at 740 nanometers. And so it's another easy way to do that as well. But if you really want the full details, I highly recommend going to the EO portal and looking at the sensor complement information.
Awesome. Thank you. We have the floor open for questions. I know it's fly. First, I would like to thank Carrie for this talk and a virtual clap of hands for this. I would request Carrie if you can stay for a couple of minutes more, and if participants, if you have any questions, you can ask them now.
Absolutely, as I'm willing to start on the phone.
Thank you so much, Carrie. For everybody who's just jumping off the call now, just to give you a small heads up, you can still ask questions, of course, but next week we're gonna have Paul Mitchell from EY talking about the mine of the future, so maybe some intersection there. I'm not sure if he's gonna talk about remote sensing specifically, but as Carrie mentioned earlier, that's definitely the cool technology that has been used for many, many years, and especially in these times now, and those systems becoming more and more powerful. It's definitely going to be something to look out for the future of mining. So yeah, make sure to tune in next week before you, when you want to hear a bit more about EY's projection of the mine of the future from Paul Mitchell. And as I said, if you got questions, I got a question if I can ask one. Do you know if there's any work going on where you would have, because you're looking into doing terrestrial-based scanning and then also comparing that to your satellite imagery. Is there any open source project where actually people could feed in their own data at certain locations and times as a kind of a...
Yes. Yes. I was just going to touch on that. So ML Hub, which is a machine learning hub, you know, there's a lot of work being done to try to fuse like some of these, you know, not so high resolution systems with things that are extremely high resolution on the ground. And so ML Hub and Radiant Earth are two that come, you know, right off the top of my head, because you can bring in your own cloud optimized geotiff. So if you have your own sensor, you're using your own Anafi drone, for example, and you're creating a digital elevation model because the ones that are in national map are maybe a little bit outdated or something. You know, that is one way to do that, to bring your own cloud optimized geotip and work within the machine learning hub environment.
Interesting, cool. Thanks so much.
Does anyone any more questions, or you're already into Copernicus 2 and looking at different locations?
I had a question. I wasn't able to see like a lot of the participants or chat. You know, I just wanted to, I have to give a metric to my boss. So I just needed to know like about how many people logged in to
We're close to 50 people at one point.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. That is
Yeah,
good.
actually for most of the seminar, I think most people just jumped off right at 5. I think people are scheduling their Zoom meetings pretty tightly. But yeah, I wrote a couple of names down, but I don't think that's going to be important for you. But yeah, about 50 people with this, right?
And you attracted people from outside of mines, by the way, Carrie, because you have such an interesting topic.
Oh, thanks. Well, I hope that, you know, I reached out to folks to get them over any fear they might have of just jumping right in and doing it. You know, it's kind of fun, you know, and I show my own kids how to look at the snowpack of our neighborhood using the Sentinel-2 indices for snow cover. You know, it's kind of fun stuff too. Sometimes it's just better to enjoy it, you know. It's very technical, yes, but the beauty of it and just being able to enjoy it, it's pretty nice, and to be able to share with your family and your friends and people that really aren't into the topic so much.
It's more of a comment from Kenna. Kenna, if you want to go ahead and ask, it'd be great. But
oh, it's not really a question. Hi, Carrie.
Hi.
Was interesting. You showed that Cottonwood Wilburg mine. That's the mine that our geologic field camp. We went and toured it for 2 days in 1981.
Uh-huh.
And then it was terrible when they had that terrible fire in 1984. I think
Yeah,
the presentation,
I see. Thank you, Kenna. I see Karen Dass is on, and she, I think, had to inspect that mine after everything had happened too.
Yeah, I was a ventilation inspector with MSHA, so I did the ventilation plans for that mine, and then after they went in recovered, we went in, and it was, when I saw that thing, my heart just dropped. It brings back some serious memories.
Yeah, even going back and doing the site visits and things, the energy is just really hard to describe. I mean, there's no scientific way to put, you know, but, you know, just, it's an incredible, you know, earthwork feat too. And so we're still monitoring that site to see how well that topsoil pocking method works in reestablishing some of the native vegetation after the pioneer species come in to establish themselves, so.
So Carrie, this is Priscilla. Thank you so much, and you're so brave. You make me feel very strong about using animations and other things on Zooms. So I'm going to be braver in the future. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It was interesting, as usual. And I'm so glad you do this because it's way beyond what I even want to try to do.
We could do it now. I mean, anybody could do it in EOBrowser. I mean.
Yeah. That's okay.
And we know
I have you on speed dial. I'm good.
Carrie, if we have any trouble. No problem.
I mean, I'm willing to do, you know, like another seminar that's more specific to, you know, like maybe getting some user applications that they want to see, and then, you know, we can just do hands-on that way if it's meaningful to do kind of that format.
Well, I can tell you that because we're grounded, we can't, as Carrie said, they can't fly drones and we can't fly in airplanes. We are dependent on the imagery that they can produce for us to be able to do some inspection work, to see changes over time, whether it's vegetation or just, you know, the amount of backfilling and grading that's done. But this is a really useful tool if you can't get to the field.
So it would be fun to see if we could maybe make an animation of Colorado School of Mines and how it's grown over the past 20 years. Or of Edgar Mine. That would be fun to see too.
I'd be happy to do that.
That would be fun.
Definitely.
What would be scary is how many houses have been built up in Golden, Colorado over the last 100 years.
That's the kind of thing that if we do it and could put it up on our website, that would be something very much interesting.
I did speak with someone from Planet Labs, and he kind of came in the last minute today with the email, but you know, they do have ways to sign up for access for universities and students. So I can, you know, maybe do just an hour segment on just Planet Labs and talk more specifically about the sensors and some of the work we're doing with their multispectral things that are just now coming online. I mean, some of them were just literally launched a week ago, so.
Yeah, and I think with our own forest fires in Colorado, it'd be interesting to look at some of those over time.
Yeah, we'll definitely make sure to reach out and keep you on your list. We have a pretty extensive list of speakers, but we'll see. Probably maybe next semester we've got a couple of more slots this semester to fill. But it was I think it's cool to have those more interactive sessions as well and give people something they can take out of the seminar. So I really like that aspect. So thanks for sharing that.
I like that aspect too, especially for folks that have mobility impairments. And, you know, we've been talking about this for a while, like how can we put geology into the hands of more people? You know, when you can't really do a field visit, you know, we can use gimbaled videography and combined with earth observations to really bring it home for them too, you know, and so that's another thing that I've been trying to brainstorm to figure out ways to do that.
There's an organization called IAGD that really deals with trying to bring and make geology accessible to the disabled. And very, very interesting thinking. And I could see, you know, we formed a tailing center of research with and education with Arizona and Colorado State. And the idea of tracking what's going on mine sites with tailings ponds over time would be really interesting as well, and easy to do, I imagine. You make it look very easy, Carrie.
I want it to be easy for everyone and not just, you know, for PhD level experts. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a good thing, you know, especially when the mining operator, like, you know, how do we solve this particular question with erosion on this road, Old Hall Road? You know, if we can bring these tools into their hands because they're on the public domain, it's going to benefit everyone in the long run. So,
and to start looking with multispectral bands and doing all the things you can do in a GIS mode of ratioing and all sorts of other things. It may be possible to do a lot more mapping of tails as they are placed. When the source moves from place to place and you change the tails, it could be pretty interesting to be able to do that. Yeah.
So Lucas and Muthu, the next meeting, the Mine of the Future meeting, I really am keenly interested in autonomous systems and control. So I would love to, you know, I don't know if that's on the open invite for anyone.
It's open.
Oh, yeah.
All our seminars are open. So we have people joining from different parts of the world. Especially, it's just the timeline at 4 o'clock. Sometimes it might be night pretty late somewhere else, but other than that, we have seen participants from everywhere, and we would love to have you. Please follow us on LinkedIn. I'll keep posting. Me and Lucas usually share every 2 days once, updating that there's a talk happening. So I'll keep you definitely posted about it. I'll send you an email about the flyer too.
Yeah, and in general, I think we have a bunch of those talks. We're always actually trying to not get too many of those technical or the magical autonomous mind type talks in, but because a lot of our contacts in the PhD world and a lot of the stuff is quite frankly happening in that space at the moment. So we actually get quite a few of those talks, and I think we're gonna have some more this semester. So definitely keep an eye out for those. It's gonna be a lot of cool things, I think.
Yeah, and also if you have any additional speaker suggestions for us, we'd be allowed to, including everyone here in the audience. If you have a certain speaker, because me and Lucas always bring our own bias in it. So we would like to hear your speaker suggestions and try to keep it more open.
I see that Brian Lorping is on. He's with Headwall, and they have like a hyperspectral sensor offering that's pretty interesting and amazing. So I don't know if you guys do outside speakers from other places, but I think that you guys would be really interested in hearing what they have to say. So
currently with the pandemic, that's what we're making use of, like basically trying to get speakers from outside, because now we can have them in Zoom and do it. Like the next speaker, which Lucas was talking about, Paul is from Australia, and he's joining us in the morning of Australia for the same seminar next week. So we would be happy to, Brian, I've tried to reach out to you. If you can just share me your email or so, or I can get it from Carrie and I'll reach out to you about scheduling something this semester or next semester.
Oh, awesome. All right.
Awesome. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks everyone for hanging out a little late, but glad to have you. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.